So with the news today, Sean Spicer out, Anthony Scaramucci coming in as communications director. We were talking with Adam Shapiro a little bit about this already. What's next for the agenda? Healthcare, they got the big vote next week. But one question we can look at, is it time now to just move on? If you're the Trump White House, Scaramucci has the Wall Street background. Maybe it's time to move from healthcare to tax reform. We discuss now with former Ohio State Senator Capri Cafaro and also National Review editor, Fox News contributor Rich Lowry, who's back with us. What do you make of that, Rich, that maybe tax reform's time has come and Scaramucci's your guy to sell it?
Well, McConnell's having this vote apparently no matter what next week, and then we'll know much more. It either passes, and if it passes with the support of Ted Cruz and Mike Lee, which it would need to pass, then it can pass the House and get signed into law, and then they can move on having succeeded at a really big promise. That seems unlikely.
That's not going to happen, right? Before I go to Capri, would you put odds on that are,
20%? Maybe?
Okay, that's not good.
20%, yeah. And then they'll move on to tax reform, and I think it's unlikely that they get a big reform. It's just very complicated, a lot of moving pieces. You have a big difference between the House and the Senate over this border adjustment tax, but I think they will be highly motivated to at least get something done, and it'll be a tax cut and a lowering of the corporate rate.
Well, they need to get a win. I mean, what do you think, Capri, about not forgetting about health care, but moving on quickly and trying to get this, and trying to get a win on the board, and that might be when it comes to tax reform?
Sure. Well, I think there's definitely a consensus that, the health care bill doesn't have a pulse, no pun intended. It's going to be incredibly difficult and a heavy lift for a number of reasons to get that thing back off of life support. That being said, I agree with my colleague that tax reform, they may be able to get some small incremental victories, so to speak, on the board, but I think doing something substantive, particularly since we have not done tax reform in any meaningful way since 1986, 31 years on. We do have the border adjustment tax, I think, is a really big one where there is differences within the Republican Party. Now, for example, the issue of repatriation, that might be something where they might be able to get, some agreement, some support from Democrats. If they focused on reducing individual tax rates before corporate tax rates, that might be another area where they might be able to bring some consensus with Democrats. But I think it's incumbent upon both parties to actually govern. And the other issue is infrastructure.
I know. We haven't talked about it in a while.
Infrastructure is one where I think they could actually get a win on the board, but the deficit hawks there might be a bit of a stumbling block. But I do think that it's probably the best bet for a bipartisan support.
To come back to taxes for a second, Rich was saying a moment ago that you didn't think they could get a big package done. What do you mean by that? What's holding it up?
Well, like a historic generational tax reform is very difficult to do.
Yeah.
You need everything to line up perfectly, and things aren't exactly lining up perfectly in Washington at the moment.
Really?
So I think, you might have noticed. You might have noticed. But if they do something on the corporate side and maybe do something imaginative to get a middle-class tax cut in there as well, maybe payroll taxes, that would be good. And just putting points on the board.
What does something on the corporate side mean?
What about earned income tax cuts?
I say, lowering the rate, and that's the politics of corporate cuts aren't great, but you get the most economic bang for your buck.
Now, you can work with Democrats on some of this, or don't you think, Capri? I mean, I even think on corporate tax cuts, if it's packaged properly, you could. No?
It's possible, but it's going to be difficult. I think that the dynamics in the House are going to be different than the dynamics in the Senate, as we've seen, across the board when it comes to trying to pass legislation. But I think if tax reform were to go through regular order, where we actually go through the process of hearings in the committees of jurisdiction, accepting amendments, really going through the deliberative process, that's really what we need to do. I think that Democrats need to step up. Democrats and Republicans need to step up and look at solutions, not just trying to fulfill campaign promises.
Messaging. I'm going to ask that as a final question, Rich, to bring it back to Scaramucci, who's in, and he's apparently, I guess, in charge of the message, right? He's the communications director of the White House. He's a Wall Street guy. That's his background. In the clip, we had a little fun with Charlie there at the start of the show. I mean, he was actually railing at the then candidate, now president, for going after hedge fund managers. So everyone's going to say, oh, tax cut for the rich. Is Anthony the guy to make the argument that, hey, tax cuts are a good idea, even if the rich people are paying a little bit less?
Yeah, it's not just Anthony. It's the Treasury Secretary is vulnerable to that charge, and just Republicans are always going to have that thrown at them. So that's why I think it's important, Steve Bannon and some others are focused on this, to have a definite middle-class element.
Right. That's got to be the focus as opposed to the top bracket. Okay, guys, thanks a lot.